Though he was a scientist by training, there was nothing rigid or predictable or orderly about him. He seemed always to be starving, walking through the door and announcing that he hadn't had lunch, and then he would eat ravenously, reaching behind my mother to steal cutlets as she was frying them, before she had a chance to set them properly on a plate with red onion salad. In private, my parents remarked that he was a brilliant student, a star at Jadavpur who had come to MIT with an impressive assistantship, but Purnamkaku was cavalier about his classes, skipping them with frequency. I went to Barnard, uptown. I didn't write very much in college at all. I was an English major. I took maybe 1 or 2 creative writing classes. I wasn't very serious about it. The only person I would consider a mentor is my writing teacher in graduate school at Boston University. I was in a writing program for a year, and there are various teachers, but the director of the program and the main teacher is Leslie Epstein, a wonderful writer, novelist, short story writer, and he sort of was the first person to tell me I was a writer, and that was very important to me. I decided to write short stories, and I think that part of the reason is that I do belong to a generation of writers for whom going to writing school, creative writing program, what have you, having a mentor is more common. And as I said, I did attend one of these programs, and usually because of the nature of the situation that you're meeting in classes weekly and sharing your work with a group of people, people tend to write in the short form simply because it's easier to look at the whole thing. He did not turn a deaf ear to her nostalgia like my father, or listen uncomprehending like me. At Walden Pond, Purnamkaku would coax my mother through the woods and lead her down the steep slope to the water's edge. She would unpack the picnic things and sit and watch us as we swam. His chest was matted with thick dark hair all the way to his waist. He was an odd sight, with his pole-thin legs and a small, flaccid belly, like an otherwise svelte woman who has had a baby and not bothered to tone her abdomen. "You're making me fat, Bodhi," he would complain, after gorging himself on my mother's cooking. He swam noisily, clumsily, his head always above the water. He didn't know how to blow bubbles or hold his breath, as I had learned in swimming class. Wherever we went, any stranger would naturally assume that Purnamkaku was my father, that my mother was his wife. It is clear to me now that my mother was in love with him. He wooed her as no other man had, with the innocent affection of a brother-in-law. In my mind, he was just a family member, a cross between an uncle and a much older brother, for in certain respects my parents sheltered and cared for him in much the same way they cared for me. He was respectful of my father, always seeking his advice about making a life in the West, about setting up a bank account and getting a job, and deferring to his opinions about Kissinger and Watergate. Occasionally, my mother would tease him about women, asking about female Indian students at MIT, or showing him pictures of her younger cousins in India. "What do you think of her?" she would ask. "Isn't she pretty?" She knew that she could never have Purnamkaku for herself, and I suppose it was her attempt to keep him in the family. But most important, in the beginning, he was totally dependent on her, needing her for those months in a way my father never did in the whole history of their marriage. He brought to my mother the first and, I suspect, the only pure happiness she ever felt. I don't think even my birth made her as happy. I was evidence of her marriage to my father, an assumed consequence of the life she had been raised to lead. But Purnamkaku was different. It was always the three of us. I was always there when he visited. It would have been inappropriate for my mother to receive him in the apartment alone.
This was something that went without saying. They had in common all the things she and my father did not: a love of music, film, leftist politics, poetry. They were from the same neighborhood in North Calcutta, their family homes within walking distance, the facades familiar to them once the exact locations were described. They knew the same shops, the same bus and tram routes, the same holes in the wall for the best jalebis and moglai parathas. My father, on the other hand, came from a suburb 20 miles outside Calcutta, an area that my mother considered the wilderness, and even in her bleakest hours of homesickness, she was grateful that my father had at least spared her a life in the Sturm home of her in-laws, where she would have had to keep her head covered with the end of her shari at all times, and use an outhouse that was nothing but a raised platform with a hole, and where in the rooms there was not a single painting hanging on the walls. Within a few weeks, Bornabgaku had brought his reel-to-reel over to our apartment, and he played for my mother medley after medley of songs from the Hindi films of their youth. They were cheerful songs of courtship, which transformed the quiet life in our apartment and transported my mother back to the world she'd left behind in order to marry my father. She and Bornabgaku would try to recall which scene in which movie the songs were from, who the actors were, and what they were wearing. My mother would describe Raj Kapoor and Nargis singing under umbrellas in the rain, or Dev Anand strumming a guitar on the beach in Goa. She and Bornabgaku would argue passionately about these matters, raising their voices in playful combat, confronting each other in a way she and my father never did. For me, it's determined by, the decision of how to narrate a story is determined by the question of point of view and searching around for the best person in the world of the story to tell the story. And in this case, I think even from the earliest drafts, I knew that it would be the daughter of this woman telling the story and observing the dynamics between her parents and this newcomer, sort of quasi-suitor, not suitor figure. And so I didn't question it, and so I think because I knew that it would be her story, I accordingly tried to just imagine what she would be seeing and what she would be picking up on and what she wouldn't be picking up on. And I also did know from a very early point in working on the story that it would be something told in hindsight. So it was both, I knew the point of view and I knew the sort of mode of the story. And that she would be looking back and that she is an adult. I'm sure there's a technical term for that sort of narration. I don't know what it is. But, so I knew that, but it wasn't a conscious decision.